Salams from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief, your primer on some of the top international news stories of the day. Today on the show, we're talking about COVID-19, we're talking about a crisis in Sri Lanka, we're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu's trial in Israel, and new developments in the murder trial of Malcolm X. We begin with a subject that continues to be in the forefront of our minds, COVID-19. We're approaching the 2-year mark since the disease emerged, and it has truly changed all our lives in multiple ways. The pandemic continues, of course. Over 5 million people have died, and people continue to lose their lives. The pandemic has truly changed our lives in multiple ways, and one of those has been the impact on those suffering other diseases such as TB, cancer, and even those suffering from mental health issues. NewsClick editor-in-chief Prabir Purkayastha spoke to immunologist Dr. Satyajit Rath on some of these issues recently. Let's listen in to a segment from that conversation.
The unfortunate part, which again people are not talking about, which is a number of diseases had a very adverse impact because of COVID-19. Normal routine surgeries did not happen. People didn't go to the hospital, so the hospitals couldn't handle it. Tuberculosis, for instance, the programs have taken a big hit because this is the kind of intervention that was required, follow-up that was required. All that didn't happen because the medical system was public health system was primarily engaged with what was really an epidemic, and a lot of the places systems were collapsing. Therefore, these are also the huge hits that we have taken.
We have taken a number of hits of this sort. At one level, what I said earlier was about the fact that data collection about all these matters has been itself disrupted. So that while we have large amounts of information, we're not quite sure how much of that information has been modified in terms of the reliability of its being gathered as a consequence of lockdowns, of people being disrupted in their professional lives and so on and so forth. But over and beyond that, here are a couple of issues. In the first place, we discovered that non-communicable diseases had major consequences for communicable disease outcomes. We discovered that hypertension and diabetes are comorbid factors for causing severe COVID-19. That in and of itself is an issue. On the other hand, we discovered that local ongoing inflammations, such as with asthmatics and related issues, may or may not be a massive trigger. Everybody had been expecting that because asthmatics have a compromised situation in their lungs, COVID-19 was going to be,
a major issue for them,
killing asthmatics left, right, and center. And that has not turned out to be the case. It's quite remarkable how we have begun to understand notions of what local inflammation and body-wide inflammation and the balances between those lead to as consequences for severe illness. So there are a number of issues of this sort. But the fact that we have been unable to treat a large number of chronic illnesses, tuberculosis, cancers, but not simply these, hypertension and diabetes have been poorly dealt with. Going beyond that, think about the other major category of illnesses for which sustained therapeutic interventions, measurements, analyses, and interventions are needed, and that is to do with mental health.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. The mental health, in fact, has been made much worse by isolation.
It has been made worse by isolation, but in addition to that, I'm connecting it to the point that you raise, that our inability to provide a public healthcare system that is robust to these disruptions has meant, just as we have been unable in brief terms to provide the anti-tuberculosis therapy medication to people, we have been unable to provide updates, testing, and medication for chronic mental health conditions. Consider what that does. Just as it leads to resistant tuberculosis and prolonged tuberculosis morbidity, mental health conditions will have significantly worsened. Have we even measured this? Have we thought about this? These are the sheer proliferation of issues that have gotten thrown up as a result of the healthcare system being put under this severe strain is going to be with us for a very, very long time to come.
So a number of issues, of course, primarily what is the long-term consequences of COVID-19? Yes, science has delivered, and as we have discussed earlier, science delivering is not enough. The public health system has also taken to the people. That, of course, is a question that Sanjit and I have been discussing for quite some time. But beyond that, there has been certain things which we can welcome, not COVID-19, but the scientific initiatives on that, and also some of the big hits we have taken. This is apart from the other hits we have taken, which is on, for instance, education, in terms of economy, which all also have effects on the health. So it's not just health and medicines, that these are isolates in society. They are a part of a larger matrix, and of course, all of that also play upon each other.
All right, we move on now to Sri Lanka, where Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government in May banned the use and import of chemical fertilizers, and it's beginning to hit hard with a worsening food crisis. Since September, farmers in the country have been protesting over shortage of any fertilizers, organic or chemical. They are fearing considerable loss of harvest at the end of the Maha cultivating season in March next year. This comes on top of a state of economic emergency in Sri Lanka, marked by inflation, shrinking household incomes, and falling forex reserves. We have with us Shreya Singh of People's Dispatch to talk more on this subject. Shreya, first of all, some context on this ban. What is the thought process behind it, and what is the government seeking to achieve?
All right. So on April 22nd, the Rajapaksa government, it released a gazette notification citing and claiming certain issues why it's completely banning the important use of agrochemicals as well as chemical fertilizers. So the reason it has given is, first of all, that although productive, the chemical fertilizers are leading to a considerable pollution of rivers, lakes and canals in the country. And also it's leading to a certain sort of non-communicable disease, kidney failures across the country, which the government has cited. Now, research shows that it is actually related to the fluoride presence in groundwater. So these are the claimed reasons. What are the next reasons? What experts are believing are the real reasons of the government taking this ban is essentially a forex crisis that Sri Lanka has been facing for a long time now, and it has been compounded by in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the tourism sector of the country, which comprises of 5% of the GDP, it has suffered immensely after the COVID-19 pandemic, and which has compounded again the forex crisis. So it's very natural for the government to be saving on its expenditure of a very import-dependent, fertilizer-dependent agricultural economy. It's natural for them to be saving on the forex, but its reasons are incongruent. So it's not for the first time that a country is going completely 100% organic producer in the region. Bhutan has done it, and scientific studies have shown that after Bhutan went completely organic in 2013, there have been a certain considerable loss in welfare losses of the agricultural households, fall of productivity at least 25%, and other losses as well. So Sri Lanka may be on the same path. What's worrying with Sri Lanka is essentially that it's been facing an economic emergency since August. It was declared in August, the economic emergency. And so there is inflation, there is a rising expenditure, falling income, like you said. And in Sri Lanka, with this ban, what's happening and why the farmers are protesting now is basically that there's been no strategy or plan of action from the government's end. There has been aid, but it's been delayed now. So the aid has come after the protests. That's the case.
Right. So what's been the impact on these farmers who are protesting?
So organic farming, as we have to understand, is an expensive process. And as was the case with Bhutan. So it definitely leads to at least 25% of fall in productivity if only all the organic fertilizers are provided to Sri Lanka to the farmers before the cultivating season. Like you said, so cultivating season has already begun, and 1.5 months we're down the cultivating season. So what we're looking at right now is a definite 25% fall in productivity if all organic fertilizers are provided. Now, Sri Lanka in October has withdrawn this ban, citing a certain sort of a productivity fall in what is a very important commercial crop, that's tea. So the tea business in Sri Lanka is a $1.3 billion business. And the plantations minister, he, after citing fall in production of tea, has taken back the ban. And the chemical fertilizers that Sri Lanka has now allowed the import of are potassium chloride from Lithuania or from nano fertilizers and liquid nitrogen from India. So it has gone back on its decision, and which makes even more clear the fact that the rationale that it had initially was never to go completely organic farming. So it was staged like a drama rather, or in its bid to become what within quotes will be 100% completely organic producer in the world. So that's the reason. What we have got to know from our sources in Sri Lanka is that how the farmers are basically now, because of a certain, there is no fertilizer, like you said. So they are now actually threatening, in a sense, to not cultivate anymore. And we are looking at a larger food crisis, the one that Sri Lanka has been facing already. So we're looking at an even more larger food crisis at the end of this season, which will happen in March and April, where we are expecting more and more of mobilizations.
And
for
it's
the-
likely to have probably a wider impact on the economy at large as well. Then therefore.
Definitely. So it's not just paddy. So paddy is a completely fertilizer dependent crop. It's so according to research, 76% of the farmers right now are dependent upon chemical fertilizers. So since there's been no aid from the government side, since there has been also no plan of action, so the farmers are left with nothing. They have already reducing incomes, and they're left with nothing. And whatever cultivation they are doing right now is going to affect the growth of the plant very naturally. So what we're looking at is a compounded food shortage. And again, so the Sri Lankan government, it has I think it has given up the price controls on the essential food items a couple of months ago. So already there's a food crisis. Already there are food prices are increasing. So it increases the hardships not only on the farmers but other sectors of the economy as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Shreya. Our next story is from Israel, where former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appeared in court on Tuesday in connection with a corruption trial. He was supposed to confront a former aide who has turned witness against him in that case, but this process has been now delayed. Netanyahu dominated, of course, Israeli politics for most of this century, including a record 12-year run as Prime Minister. He continues to be leader of the opposition. The corruption cases against him were a major factor in his failure to return to power in the last elections. Prashant now joins the show. Prashant, good to have you back. What are the allegations of corruption against Netanyahu, Prashant, and what sort of impact have they had on him?
Right. So the cases are numbered case 1000, case 2000, and case 4000, and they mainly have to do with various, policy decisions his government may have taken, in, which may have benefited him in various ways and his interlocutors.
Right.
So if you look at case 1000, the idea is that he got certain gifts from businessmen. Case 2000 basically says that he worked with a media agency, or there were discussions between a prominent media agency and him, and there was a regulation being discussed which would have been to the loss of another major newspaper in the country, and he would have got some benefits. And one of the most important cases, which is case 4000, is regarding one of the biggest media conglomerates in Israel called Bezek. And the idea is that, again, certain regulatory decisions that favored Bezek were taken or would have been taken, which on the other hand, whereas at the same time Bezek's major media outlet gave very favorable coverage to Netanyahu.
Right.
So it's basically a large issue of graft, quid pro quo, however you call it. And these are and so there have been a lot of course, witnesses that have been called, including a couple of people who were part of his circle, including a close aide, like you said, who was supposed to depose on Tuesday. That has been postponed to November 22nd. But these cases have been sort of, in the make for some time. I think in 2019 they were officially filed. And in Israel, you don't lose your job if a case like this is filed. So the trial continues.
Right.
And Netanyahu, of course, chose to brave it out. Kept proclaiming his innocence. Said that he was not going to back down. And I would say that the corruption trials did play a part in the increasing disenchantment with him, because what we saw from 2019 to until 2021, around 2 years, Israel had 4 elections.
Right.
Now, Israel is a very fractious political system whereby, it's difficult for one party to form the government. It always has to be an alliance.
Right.
So there's 120 seats. the leading parties usually get somewhere around 32 or 33 or something. And then there's this rush there's this mad series of negotiations to reach the magic mark. Right. So, what also we saw over the past few years was that there were increasing protests against Netanyahu over the corruption, over his handling of COVID, over, multiple his failures of governance. And the corruption angle was a key element in many people increasingly getting dissatisfied with him. It was also a key element in many of his former allies, for instance, becoming slightly wary of whether to continue supporting him, which led to all of them, working out further negotiations and stuff. And what happened was in June this year, so his former allies, his former opponents, even some Arab parties all came together to form the first non-Netanyahu government in 12 years, and that was like a big moment. So whether directly this destroyed his image, no, he still remains very popular. We'll come to that later. But nonetheless, the fact is that this could have been one of the factors that prevented him from returning to power, definitely. So it remains to be seen how long these trials will take, how long these cases will take. But nonetheless, the fact remains that their continuation and the fact that he's not now a prime minister also actually affects his chances in these cases.
Yeah. So what does it say for his political career or the future of his political career?
Right. So Benjamin Netanyahu, very extremely problematic player in some ways, if you look at it in terms of how very controversial, because it would not be wrong to say that under Netanyahu, Israel's politics, Israel's society has moved much to the right. And some of the people who have suffered the worst out of this have been the Palestinians, of course, against whom the government has taken a series of policy decisions. So, there was, for instance, in the 90s, there was the Oslo Accords, where Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization signed a series of agreements. Under Netanyahu's regime, especially, their move has been in completely the other direction.
Right.
So while post-Oslo governments or all Israeli governments are also not friendly to the Palestinians, under Netanyahu it was a completely different level. So this mass-scale building of settlements to sort of splinter and scatter the Palestinians, the kind of attacks that took place, including recently in May. The attack on Gaza was seen by many as an attempt by Netanyahu to hold on to power and retain his popularity. So time and again he used the Palestinians, he used, for instance, tensions with Iran, his relations with Donald Trump to sort of domestically prop himself up. And the fact remains that Netanyahu remains popular among his party, definitely at least. I think a recent poll has shown that a majority of people who support his party, the Likud party, continue to believe that he's their best bet.
Right.
So Netanyahu definitely not out of the picture at all. Recently, he suffered a blow in the fact that the Israeli parliament passed a budget. Now, if they had not passed a budget, fresh elections would have been called, and he would have had a chance to sort of, again be the a major player again. He remains ahead of one of the biggest party probably, and he has a very strong influence. Just that right now, all his rivals and former allies have all combined together against him, and that's a very tentative alliance, tenuous alliance. Let's be very clear. It's not that they're bound by anything. Most of all these parties are bound, one by the desire for power, two by the desire, the opposition to Netanyahu, right? So that's really what keeps them together. So for him, the key challenge, or the question is how to sort of try to break this alliance. At any point of time, could be now, could be 2 years from now, when there'll be a switch in the prime minister's position. His attempt will be to break this alliance and then tell the Israeli people that he is their best bet for a stable government or whatever. But the fact nonetheless remains that the impact of Netanyahu's governance over the past decade has had a massive impact on the region, many of it extremely problematic, like I said, because it has increased tensions, it has caused greater suffering, it has, the kind of position he's taken towards Iran, for instance, has proved very, very dangerous in terms of how people, the regional situation has been. We have come close to war because of Netanyahu's positions and his proximity to Trump. So all this together, very, very unfortunate, a very problematic record, for lack of a better word. So it remains to be seen. He's not out of the picture, but he's not that close to coming back to power either.
Right. And of course, we'll keep an eye on how those court cases and trials go. But finally, a blast from the past, which has implications, of course, even today. 2 men convicted of the assassination of civil rights leader Malcolm X are said to be exonerated. Muhammad Aziz, now 83 years old, and the late Khalil Islam were convicted in 1966, a year after Malcolm X was killed, and were only released on parole in the mid-80s. They've always maintained their innocence, which is likely to be confirmed today. Prashant, very interesting story. There's so many years incarceration where they have steadfastly maintained their innocence.
One of the more interesting things is that even the person who was convicted for the assassination, his name is Mujahid Halim, he also said that these two were not involved,
Yeah.
right? So, and now
No
of
physical
course,
evidence.
exactly, and now actually the reason for the exoneration is the realization that the government withheld a lot of evidence that could have actually proved, proved the fact that these two men were innocent. And I think Al Sharpton, who is considered one of the successors of Malcolm X's legacy, has pointed out the the horrible irony in this, because you have somebody who struggled for racial justice, who had a very unique perspective, whether you agree with it or not, who continues to be an inspiration to radical struggles across the world today, from India to South Africa to Latin America. You'll find Malcolm X's posters, Malcolm X's quotes to this day, being cited by young people, cited by people who are unhappy with the reformist politics of many people around them, who want structural change. But his assassination itself, the investigation, was a cover-up job, and two innocent people were, put in jail for over 20 years for that. And that is really a metaphor for how the United States works. Tragically enough, today we continue to see that. We continue to see black people getting killed, black people getting arrested wrongly, black people being targeted for various reasons. So these are, I think, in some senses, although it may just read like a historical, just like an update to history, it's still a very strong reflection of how the country is even today.
Absolutely. All right, that will do it for the show today. You've been watching Daily Debrief, and for more on all of these stories, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and follow us on all the social media channels. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.